EA Sports College Football 25 is coming out in a couple of days, and one of the most popular modes is Dynasty. And the important question in Dynasty is, what team am I going to rebuild first? Now, what I've done today is I have compiled a mathematical formula on Excel with a bunch of different factors regarding each program and ranked every single team from number 1 to number 134 in this video. One thing I'd like to point out is I've created a College Football 25 giveaway on my Twitter at Big Ends Gaming. There are a couple of things you have to do, one of them being subscribe, so make sure you subscribe. So here's the Excel formula. Obviously, I'm not going to, leak the lists before I go over it, but a couple things. So I just did the name of the school, the conference. This is the first factor. Last year, this is just I manually entered a score for every team based off of their record last year. And the higher the number, the better it is for your final score. And the higher the number, the worse you were last season. Percentage-wise, this is your overall winning percentage in the last 4 years from 2020 to 2024. Again, the lower it is, the better score you're going to get. Because if you've had a team that's dominated the past 4 years, it's going to be a worse team to rebuild. Now, for the percentage all-time, this is different. All-time, I preferred schools with higher percentages because they have a really high prestige in their program. Score for recruiting, the higher recruiting class, the more points you get to your final score. Same exact thing for the transfer portal. And one thing, I just scaled them all on a scale of 5 points. That's really what these are for. The conference weight. The conference weight is basically it takes which conference the school is in and it gives them a score. The worst conference, in my opinion, I think the highest scoring conference is the CUSA. So the CUSA gets the highest points for conference weight. The SEC is the best conference, in my opinion, so they get the lowest amount of points, all going into the final score. And then I ranked all 134 teams based off their final score for this video. So let's get into it. Coming in at dead last, we have Air Force. Now, no disrespect to one of the military schools, but they've been pretty successful lately, which hurts their score. They get no transfers, and their recruiting class is really bad. The defending national runners-up lost a lot, including their coach Caleb DeBoer. Now, they've been successful lately, of course, but their recruiting class was okay, and their transfer portal class was pretty solid, but being in the Big Ten now, there isn't too much to rebuild. Now moving to the team that just beat them in the national championship, the defending champion Michigan Wolverines. I mean, there's no rebuilding to do with this team. They're the defending champs. They have a great recruiting class. They've had success lately. A new team in the ACC, SMU, has been successful as of late. Now, prestige-wise, they haven't been the best program all time. They had the death penalty, so that hurts their score. And the recruiting class for this year isn't that good. Here we have another military school in Army, similarly to Air Force. They have a pretty bad recruiting class coming into this year, and they don't accept any transfers, so their score is going to be extremely low. Coming off a double-digit win season, New Mexico State looks to continue that success. They have a pretty bad recruiting class and a horrible transfer portal class this year, though, which pretty much kills their score alongside their very low prestige. Oklahoma State has already been extremely successful as of late, led by Ollie Gordon, their All-American running back. They have okay recruiting class and transfer portal class, but overall, their recent success hurts their score. Liberty has just been super successful lately since joining the CUSA. They have an all-time winning percentage that's very high in the FBS, and the recruiting class and transfer portal classes aren't good, making their score pretty bad. UTSA has been very successful as of late in the American Conference. Their all-time prestige is not that high, and their recruiting and transfer portal classes aren't the best, putting them near the bottom. I mean, if you want to play with this offense, go right ahead. But Iowa, regardless of how terrible it was, has been an extremely successful football program, and there isn't much to rebuild, and they have a really bad transfer portal class this year. Straight up, if you rebuild Georgia, what are you doing, bro? They've been the most successful program in the last 4 years. They've had multiple national championships, have one of the best recruiting classes. What is the point? Kansas State won a Big 12 title 2 years ago, defeating TCU. Their overall prestige is not the best, and their recruiting classes and transfer portal classes aren't amazing, so there's not much to be excited for in a rebuild. Tulane has had back-to-back 10-plus win seasons in the American, so there isn't too much to rebuild in that sense. You could move them to a power conference, but on the other hand, their prestige isn't very high. Their recruiting class is okay, and their transfer portal class is okay, putting you in a really weird situation to rebuild them. Troy's had some big upset wins, one of notable being against LSU a couple of years ago, but overall, they have barely any transfers coming in. Their recruiting class isn't that good, and they've just been a little above average. UCLA has been an extremely average power football program. Their overall prestige is a little above 50%. Their success lately has been okay at around 62%, and their recruiting is not amazing. Their transfer portal is okay. Now, there are going to be a lot of teams where you're thinking, man, they're pretty low. And Wyoming, I guess, in a sense, is pretty low. But, I'm trusting my Excel formula. And a couple big factors for Wyoming being this low is their transfer portal class is really, really bad, making it very difficult to be successful with this team. Ole Miss, on the other hand, has one of the best transfer portal classes for this upcoming season. But again, is in the SEC, so there's not much to rebuild. And they're a projected top 10 team for this season, so why would you do a dynasty with them? The Ohio Bobcats are another one of these teams that are in a conference like the Mid-American where they don't really have anything special with them, have a terrible transfer portal class, recruiting is meh, overall prestige is below 500, and, the past couple of years they've been okay. San Jose State won the Mountain West in the COVID year, and that's about it. Everything else they've done has been not the best. Everything, regarding recruiting, transfer portal is okay. I can already tell I'm going to get some comments about James Madison coming in at 115. A couple things to note about James Madison is they've only been in the FBS for 2 years. They've been extremely successful in those 2 years, so they don't need that much help. And they don't really have a good recruiting class coming in. So mathematically, it puts them near the bottom, but, a James Madison rebuild would be fun. Similarly to other programs, Miami of Ohio has just been okay. They haven't been too special. I think they were in the MAC Conference Championship this year. Don't quote me on that. But ultimately, there just isn't really that much promising with this program, and their transfers are terrible. Fresno State is an interesting program. They've had some really good NFL players like Derek Carr, Devontae Adams, and they had some success lately. But overall, kind of just like a bunch of these other teams where they've had okay recruiting classes and transfer portal classes, which don't make them as exciting as other teams. Memphis is a similar situation to James Madison. I think Memphis would be a cool team to rebuild, but mathematically they score pretty low on my Excel sheet because they've been really successful, having a couple American Athletic Championship appearances back when UCF was still in the conference, and they have a pretty okay recruiting class and good transfer portal class, but man, that offense would be fun to play with in a power conference. Northwestern ranks low, especially being in the Big Ten, because they're already in one of the 2 best conferences. In the past couple of years, they haven't been that good. They've seen success, but in the past 1 year or 2, they've been pretty bad. And, overall, their recruiting is just nothing special. Missouri is one of the more up-and-coming programs in college football, but, they're in the SEC already. And they had a great recruiting class and a great transfer portal class, but they're going to be like a top 10 team, especially with Luther Burden at wide receiver. The last of the 3 military schools is Navy, kind of saying the same thing. They don't accept transfers in, so they get 0 points in that aspect, which really hurts them. And the recruiting class is one of the worst in the country. Toledo last year was okay in the MAC. Overall, they're right around 60% in winning percentage. But their transfer portal class is really bad, which hurts their score. Louisiana is kind of in a similar situation. They've been a lot more successful lately. But, Louisiana is another one of these non-power conferences that just doesn't really have anything that stands out for me. Georgia State is extremely similar to Louisiana, except they've had less success than Louisiana in the Sun Belt. Their overall FBS winning percentage is pretty bad at around 38. Rice recently joined the American. They didn't have the best season last year. They haven't been a good program in a while. So on paper, that might seem like a good team to rebuild, but you have pretty much nothing to work with their recruiting and transfer portal classes. Jacksonville State had a great first season in the FBS last year, but that alone is going to hurt their score only being in the FBS for 1 year. They don't have a big history being this, football program that's been successful. And the recruiting and transfer portal classes have been pretty bad for this upcoming year, which really hurts their score. Poor Oregon State, man. They kind of got screwed with their conference. They will be playing on a Mountain West schedule, although they're technically still in the Pac-12. Anyway, they've been successful the past couple years, but the future just doesn't look bright at this program. Here's another team that a lot of people are going to hate me for putting in the 100s. Coastal Carolina mathematically does not do very well. They've been successful recently. The past 1 to 4 years, they've been a very good team in the Sun Belt, which hurts their score because you'd rather play with teams that have been performing worse as of late. And their recruiting is just, average. Here's another one that people are going to get frustrated with me about, Appalachian State. It's pretty much the exact same story as Coastal Carolina. They've been successful. Their prestige is a little higher because they beat Michigan that one time. But their recruiting is pretty much about the same, not the best. Coming in at 100, we have Maryland. They're a team in the Big Ten that hasn't been successful at all recently, which means that they would be a fun team to rebuild, but already being in the second best conference in college football really kills their score, honestly. Number 99 is Alabama. Now, I kind of expected Alabama to be a lot lower, being the best program in the past 10 to 15 years, but I guess their score goes up a little bit because they haven't had the dominance that they have had in previous years. Caleb DeBoer's coming in, Nick Saban's out, even though you won't be using Caleb DeBoer. But if you use Alabama regardless, why would you rebuild Alabama? NC State has honestly been one of the most underrated programs in college football the past couple of years. They've had a bunch of seasons where they finished in the top 25, but that also means that they don't necessarily need help. And they're already in the ACC, which is a good conference, and they have a really good recruiting class and transfer class, which helps their score. But there's not much to rebuild because they're already doing so well. Oregon is another team that I honestly think is too high. I don't even know why they're in the top 100. They're one of the best teams in the country this upcoming season. They just moved to the Big Ten. They're in a really good conference. They have a stacked recruiting class, stacked transfer portal class, which helps their score in a sense. So maybe that's why them and Alabama are higher. But they don't need rebuilding at all. Utah just joined the Big 12 after the death of the Pac-12, and Utah's been very successful as of late. I think that they're higher up on this list, being a very good team, because their recruiting class and their transfer portal class this season are not nearly as good as other teams that are projected to be in the top 15. Iowa State's an interesting program because they've had a lot of success lately, with Brock Purdy, Breece Hall, a bunch of other players, but they haven't been as good the past couple years. But regardless, they're already in a great conference in the Big 12. The New Mexico Lobos, they have been a very bad team as of late. They've been the laughingstock of the Mountain West. Last year, they were really bad, which helps their score. Overall, not good, prestige-wise, which helps their score. But oh my goodness, their recruiting class was terrible, which kills their score. If their recruiting was a little better, it would be in the 60s or 50s in this list. Cincinnati's coming in at 93. They're an interesting program because they just had their first season in the Big 12, which didn't go too well. But I think their score really hinders on the fact that they were super successful in the American, making the playoff as a group of 5 team. Clemson is another program that, although they've kind of been on the downswing as of late, they don't need rebuilding. They've been dominant, and I honestly think if their transfer portal score, which is 0 because Dabo Swinney doesn't believe in the transfer portal, they would be higher, but I don't really care. Clemson does not need rebuilding. Arizona just had one of the most successful seasons in the past decade for that program, but their coach just left. Overall, they're not the best team, prestige-wise. They're okay. The past 4 years have been terrible if you don't include last year, and their recruiting is okay. LSU is another team that I don't really need to explain myself. They don't need a rebuild. They're already in the SEC. They already have a really good recruiting class. Louisville is a team that has been good recently. They were bad before that, and then they were really good before being really bad with Lamar Jackson. Already in the ACC. They have a really good transfer portal class. Notre Dame is another one of these schools that doesn't need rebuilding. Now, they could use some retooling because they've been trying to get a national championship, but they mess it up every year. But they're getting 10 wins almost every season. They're getting stacked recruiting classes. They don't need a rebuild. They're Notre Dame. Tennessee, I feel like I'm repeating myself. This is another really strong program in the SEC. They're already in the best conference, which really hurts their score. But overall, they've just been a really good team, and they have a really good recruiting class. Finally, coming back to a non-power school, we have South Alabama, which overall, since joining the FBS, has been okay. They've been about 500 in the past 4 seasons. Overall, they've been pretty bad at around 40%. Their recruiting is okay, but their transfer portal is just terrible, which kills their score. UNLV is a program that is known for their rich history in basketball, not in football. But being from Las Vegas, it could be an interesting team to rebuild, but they just have no history football-wise, and the recruiting is nothing special. Utah State is another one of these Mountain West teams that are kind of just like there. They've been really good in basketball, but not in football in a sense. There's just nothing special about this program, and the recruiting class and transfer portal class are both not the best, so you don't really have much to work with on this roster. Kentucky is an interesting one because they've been more successful, but they haven't been like extremely successful. They're also already in the SEC, so you're not going to be changing conferences. West Virginia is a really interesting one. They have a very rich history with guys like Pat White, Noel Devine back in the OG Big East. Lately, they haven't really been that good. They've been decent in the Big 12. But this is a team that you could move to a better conference, maybe. I don't know if the Big 12 is better than the ACC, but you could move them to like the SEC or the Big 10 and really turn them into the powerhouse that they used to be. But they're already decently strong. Texas is coming in at 81. They're another team that does not need rebuilding. I mean, they just came off a playoff performance that was pretty good. They came up a little short against Washington, but they came off one of their best seasons in a long time. And they're going to be in the top 5. Eastern Michigan's score gets destroyed by their overall prestige at 33%. They've just been a terrible program in the MAC ever since they've been in the FBS. Really kills their score, and their recruiting and their transfer portal classes are not good, which means there's not a good history in this program and not a good roster. Coming in at 79, we have Florida State. This is another team that just came off a really good season. They're a very historic program. They've won national championships. They've had Heismans and Jameis Winston and other guys, so they don't really need help. Texas State is an interesting team to rebuild. On paper, they might be a nice team, but just based off of my formula, it really checks out. They've been terrible the past 4 years, and their overall prestige is really bad. Oklahoma is another team that doesn't need any help. They've been one of the best programs of all time and recently joined the best conference. Ohio State is another program that certainly doesn't need help. Marshall has been decent in the past 4 years. Overall, they're just below 500, and the recruiting is just average. Everything about their score is just average. Now, Kansas is a really interesting one because they've seen success the past couple of years, but their score overall in the past 4 years is still really low because of how terrible they were before, which hurts their score. Overall prestige is also low, but the recruiting is pretty solid. Old Dominion, there's really nothing good about their score. The past couple of years, they've been really bad. Overall, they've been pretty bad. They beat Virginia Tech one time, and the recruiting and transfer portal classes are really bad. So there's nothing special about this program, and there's nothing special about their current roster. Penn State, another program that certainly doesn't need help. They could use retooling to get them over the hump and win a national championship, but they're a perennial top team every year. BYU could be an interesting team to rebuild. They recently joined the Big 12, but overall they've been pretty successful with Zach Wilson and a couple other guys, which, ends up hurting their score. UAB is an interesting program because, they stopped playing football for a couple of years during the 11 years that the game didn't exist. But overall, they've been pretty average just across the board, and their recruiting and transfer portal scores are not amazing. Western Kentucky is another one of these programs that it's just a really average score. There's not much else I can say. The thing about a bunch of these non-power schools is you could pretty much take any of them and rebuild them, and it'll be fun because they're not good. I just rank them based off of, their potential being the transfer portal and their recruiting classes recently, and how successful they've been as a program. Kennesaw State is in their first year in the FBS, and they're coming in at 68 because they have zero history as an FBS school, of course. Their success lately, has been pretty solid, but it was in the FCS, and the recruiting and transfer portal classes against all the other FBS schools are really low. Duke is an interesting team. I feel like they would be kind of fun to rebuild, but they're already in the ACC. They're already such a big school. where there isn't, you know, that much to rebuild in a sense. Like, you could get them to be a powerhouse, but they're already a decent school, you know, really prestigious academically. They've been decently successful as of late, but I think there are definitely better options for Power 4 schools. Sam Houston, another team that has recently joined the FBS. This is going to be their second season in the FBS. Last year they kind of struggled, but before that, you know, winning an FCS championship in 2020, they were a really good team in the FCS, but their recruiting, transfer portal, like, this is just a really bad roster. Wake Forest had a really nice year with Sam Hartman in 2021. Ever since then, they haven't been the best. You know, they kind of just had that one good year, and every other year they've been not the best in the ACC. This is kind of similar to Duke, where you could rebuild them, but they're not like a horrible program, and they're 100% better teams in the ACC, let alone in the Power 4. UNC has been a pretty successful football school. You know, they've had guys like Mitchell Trubisky, who didn't end up working out in the NFL, but he was great in college. Drake May, Sam Howell. They've had good quarterbacks. They've had other good players. So they've been a pretty good program, and already being in the ACC hurts their score, but they're going to be a little higher than other schools because their prestige is higher and their recruiting class is higher. BC is such an interesting program. They have not been successful in a long time. That helps their score in a sense because their prestige is still pretty high, where they've been unsuccessful lately, but they're still a prestigious program in a sense. They're not like a super prestigious program, but that helps their score a lot. The birthplace of college football, as they say, Rutgers is a team that has struggled for a long time. Overall, they're around 500 prestige-wise, and recruiting is pretty solid, but their transfers are not good. Mississippi State, I feel like they haven't done anything in a while, but they used to be good, you know, with Dak Prescott when he was there. Overall, they're just average. I mean, in the past 4 years, they've been barely over 500. As a program, they've been barely over 500. And being in the SEC, that hurts their score. North Texas is another one of these teams in a non-power conference. They recently joined the American. They've been a little below average prestige-wise, and their recruiting is okay. Just everything about their score is just meh. Minnesota had like that one good year a couple years ago. I think it was 2019 when they won 10 or so games with PJ Fleck, I think was their coach. But, you know, this would be a cool team to rebuild, but they're already in the Big Ten, which definitely hurts their score. The self-proclaimed national champions of UCF recently joined the Big 12, and they've been, you know, pretty good. Prestige-wise, they're higher because of their success in, you know, 2017, 2018, that era. And their recruiting class is pretty good. Their transfer portal class is pretty good. So they rank in at 58. Now, even though this picture has terrible frames, and the only reason I did it is because I tried to get a picture in-game of every school, and this was all there was for Hawaii. Hawaii would be a pretty fun team to program, a pretty fun team to rebuild. You know, they're from Hawaii. You have to go to Hawaii every time you play them. That in itself would be pretty fun to be playing in Hawaii, but they haven't been a successful team at all, and their recruiting and transfer portal classes are not good, which really hurts their score. I think if those were higher, they'd be in the top 20. Real ball knowledge, Paxton Lynch of Northern Illinois, the glory days of this program. The 2 seasons he was their starting quarterback, he was insane. That single-handedly really helps their prestige, but outside of that, they haven't been a good program at all. They have barely any transfers coming in. That hurts them, but again, like most of these non-power schools, they're going to be fun to rebuild regardless. The proclaimed toughest place to play in college football 25 is Texas A&M. They rank higher than other teams like Alabama, Notre Dame, Ohio State because they have not been that successful as of late. You know, don't count 20, or you can, I'm not saying to not count 2020 because it certainly counts, but that's really been their only year where they've been where they should be as a program. They've struggled as of late, which, you know, helps their score in a sense because they're already in the SEC, and if they're doing well in the SEC, why would you ever rebuild them? And I know that I'm going to get so much hate for this. Boise State's coming in at 54, but I'm not rigging this. I'm letting the math decide. I think that they should be higher, of course, but Boise State, they have been one of the most successful, if not the most successful winning percentage teams of all time in the FBS, which really helps their score. They're just one of the best programs ever that isn't in a power conference. putting them in a power conference could be a really fun thing to do. Putting them in the Big 12 and then moving them to the SEC. It will be really fun to do, but their transfer portal class is god-awful, and the recruiting class is okay, which hurts their score. I think if those were higher, they'd be very high up in this list. Illinois is a team that has just not been good at all, which is good because they're in the Big Ten. If you have a Big Ten team that you want to rebuild, has to be a team like Illinois because they have been very unsuccessful. If you got a team that's been successful and they're in the second best conference, there's no point. Georgia Southern is basically the same as all these other schools. Everything about them has just been average, resulting in a little above average score. The thing that helps them out is their recruiting class compared to other teams in the Sun Belt, in the MAC, and the CUSA, and their overall prestige is just above 500, so that helps. Wisconsin is kind of similar to Texas A&M, where they're a very good program, but they haven't been as successful as they should be lately, which helps their score because they already have a good recruiting class, a good transfer class, and they're in the Big Ten. USC is kind of similar to Wisconsin and A&M. Now, with Caleb Williams in their first year winning 11 games, that's different. But last year they weren't too successful. Before that, they weren't successful before Lincoln Riley. This is one of the most prestigious programs of all time, which also helps their score a lot. Central Michigan, again, another one of these teams that is just, average across the board. Overall prestige, a little above 500, which puts them above other schools in the lower conferences. TCU just recently made the playoff 2 years ago, and they, oh my God, 65-7. I'm sorry if you're a TCU fan, but that was hard to watch. But regardless, just making the playoff 2 years ago is going to kill your score because that means they've been successful in the past 4 years, which they have, which hurts your score. Putting them at 48 and then being in a big conference already hurts them too. But, they're ranking higher than other Big 12 schools because they're pretty good with their recruiting class and their transfer class. Houston is a really popular choice. I've seen this everywhere on Twitter and TikTok. Houston, they've had success in the past. They joined the Big 12. This is their second year in the Big 12. Big market in Houston for recruiting. Washington State is another team that is playing on a Mountain West Conference schedule, although still technically being in the Pac-12. This is a team that ranks pretty high up, being at 46, because they've been about just below average in the past 4 years and overall, and the recruiting classes are okay, so they score out higher than other teams. Florida Atlantic is another team that is scoring pretty high because they had a pretty bad year last year. I think that's the difference of all of these teams in the non-power conferences is, they all pretty much have similar recruiting classes and similar prestige scores, similar transfer portal scores, but their season last year really impacts their score. And I think that's why Florida Atlantic is higher up. The school that produced Patrick Mahomes, the best NFL quarterback, you'd think that they'd be a good program, and they haven't really done much since 2007, when they had Michael Crabtree that 1 year. But Texas Tech is probably one of the best schools to rebuild in the Power 4 because they're not in one of the best conferences, so you can maybe move them to the SEC when you get better. Their recruiting is pretty good. Buffalo pretty much scores exactly the same. Like all of these schools in the MAC and all these conferences have similar scores. The reason why Buffalo is higher is because they did not have a good year last year. Same thing here for Ball State. Yes, this is a Ball State picture. You can see it on one of their shirts. Ball State, on paper, they've been just below average the past 4 years. The past, their entire prestige-wise. Recruiting is okay. Transfer portal, not the best. But because they had such a bad year last year, it really helps their score. Shout out Bordeaux for this picture of Bowling Green. This is the only thing that I've seen of Bowling Green in the game, so I'm using it. But Bowling Green is extremely similar to Ball State. They have worse numbers the past 4 years, but they had a better season last year, so they kind of cancel each other out. Prestige-wise, they're a little better. Recruiting, they're a little better, which puts them over Ball State. Virginia Tech used to be a really good program. They had Michael Vick. They've played in the national championship, but lately they've been okay. They have a pretty promising schedule this season, but being in the ACC, they have a pretty good prestige, pretty good recruiting class. Being in the ACC, it's not going to help them be super high up. South Carolina used to be such a good program in the 2010s, and then they kind of just fallen off lately. They're in the SEC, which hurts them, but their recruiting class and their transfer class are both very good. This is a program that should be on the rise. Middle Tennessee is pretty much the exact same situation as Bowling Green. Overall, just okay. They've been average the past 4 years, and prestige-wise, recruiting and transfer portal classes are both not amazing, but they had a bad year last year, which makes them a better team to rebuild. San Diego State, they had a couple good years with Rashad Penny, and what's his name, the other running back, I can't remember. But lately they've been pretty bad, and they're definitely more well known for their basketball skills. The past 4 years they've been pretty solid, a little over 500. Same with prestige. So their prestige and their recruiting class and their transfer class being higher than a bunch of other Mountain West schools puts them at 37. Charlotte has probably been one of the worst programs in the FBS since joining the FBS in 2015, I think. They recently joined the American, which I'm not sure why they did that, because they didn't even have success in the CUSA. They've been really bad in the past 4 years with a winning percentage just over 30. Same with their prestige at 31. But their recruiting and their transfer portal classes are getting a little better. But ultimately, this would be a great team to rebuild in a big market in Charlotte. Arkansas is an SEC team that ranks very high in the, out of all the SEC teams. They're genuinely skewed lower because they're already in the best conference. But, the past couple of years have been pretty difficult for them. They had one good year in 2021, I'm pretty sure, but last year they struggled mightily, which helps their score a lot. Baylor is they're not pretty much the same thing as Arkansas. They've been very successful some years. And other years they've been really bad. They remind me of the Giants, where they with the odd year and even year in the MLB. They've had really good years and then really bad years, and they're coming off a really bad year, which helps their score. But overall, good transfer portal class, good program out in Waco. Tulsa is a program that I feel like could be doing so much better. They're in a big market in Oklahoma. Oklahoma City isn't really, or it's not in Oklahoma City. It's in Tulsa. I'm stupid, but it's a big city. It's a decently big school, I think, but they're ranking high because they were pretty bad last year, and they're overall just about average with their prestige. So this is a team that you could really take over the hump and move them to the Big 12. Indiana is ranking really high, even though they're in the Big 10, strictly because they haven't had that much success. Outside of the COVID year in 2020 with Michael Penix, they have not been a good program. The past 4 years, winning percentage of 34, overall winning percentage of 41. Recruiting is okay, transfer portal is good, so they have promising young players. Arkansas State is going to be ranking pretty high, coming in at 31. The past 4 years, they've been really bad. Winning percentage of 31, which helps their score because they've been bad. Last year, they were pretty bad in a sense. Overall prestige is below 500. Recruiting is okay. This would be a good team to rebuild. Purdue is another team in the Big Ten that has not been that successful as of late. Now, yes, they did just play in the Big Ten championship game 2 years ago, I think. But it's because the Big Ten, the Big Ten West, I can't speak, has just been terrible for forever. Colorado State is an interesting program to rebuild. They have a big rivalry with Colorado, who's the social media star team. But Colorado State, the past 4 years, has been terrible. Winning percentage of 30. Overall, they've been a little below 500, and their recruiting is okay. Transfer portal class is not the best. This seems like a program that could really use a new coach that could take them over the hump. Before I made this list, Virginia was one of the teams that I've been considering for my Dynasty series on my YouTube channel. And I'm not going to be revealing who that is in this video. And no, the number one team isn't automatically going to be my Dynasty team. I will give you guys a hint. It's not Virginia. It's going to be a team in the top 10. So that'll narrow it down. But regardless, let's focus on Virginia. They have not been a good program in a long time in football. The past 4 years, they've had a winning percentage below 40. Overall prestige is just below 500. Their recruiting classes are not the best. Same with their transfer portal class. Okay. But being in a conference like the ACC and being so unsuccessful as of late, that would make it a good team to rebuild. Nevada being a state school, the whole state of Nevada is what they're named after. That helps them with recruiting, but they've had a bad recruiting class for this year. They had a really bad year last year, which really helps their score. This team would be a sick team to become like a power team in like the Big 12. California is a very intriguing team to rebuild. They recently joined the ACC, so they're not in one of the best conferences, but they're in a power conference. They have not been successful lately. They've been below 40% winning percentage the last 4 years, but they've had successful years in the past with Aaron Rodgers and other notable players. Their transfer class is really good. That really helps their score. Louisiana Monroe actually beat Nick Saban's Alabama Crimson Tide one year, but regardless, this team needs help. The past 4 years, winning percentage below 22, that is horrible. That really helps their scores, that they've been terrible the past 4 years. Overall prestige just above 500. Transfer portal class is terrible. This team needs a lot of help, and that puts them in the top 25. Georgia Tech is another one of these ACC schools that hasn't been good lately. They've had a couple good years in the past. They've had good players like Calvin Johnson, but Georgia Tech is a team that needs help in a conference like the ACC. Overall prestige is high, but they haven't been successful as of late. Those are the best scoring teams in my formula. Teams that have not been good lately but have a really high prestige. Coming in at 23, we have the Temple Owls. They had 1 year where they won the American and they upset Navy, but outside of that, they've been terrible the last 4 years. Another team that's just been god-awful. 23 winning percentage in the past 4 seasons. Overall prestige is lower. It's below 500. This team would be a really cool team to rebuild. They're a big school, they're a notable school, and a big city in Philadelphia. Here's another ACC team, like I mentioned earlier, in Pittsburgh. Past 4 years, they've actually been pretty good. They have a 58 winning percentage in the past 4 years. Of course, they had that great season with Kenny Pickett where they won the ACC. Their overall prestige is high, being at 58%. Their recruiting class is pretty good, and their transfer portal class is pretty good. But they rank really high because they were god-awful last year. Michigan State is a really interesting team to be in the top 21 because they're notably a really successful program with a 59 winning percentage in the overall. But they have one of the best transfer portal classes in the country, which really puts them into the top. I think that they've favored with, this formula. I think that they're kind of an easier team to rebuild, but they'll still come in at 21. Western Michigan, they had that one undefeated season and then they lost to Wisconsin. Outside of that, been just a typical MAC school, been right around average the past 4 years, and overall, they had a pretty bad year last year, which puts them in the top 20. Now, me personally, do I think Auburn deserves to be number 19? No. Why they scored so high in my formula, I totally understand. Lately, they have not been where they need to be as a program. They've been below 500 in the past 4 seasons. Their overall prestige is really high. So meaning last year was not a good year for them. Helps their score. Last 4 years have not been good. Helps their score. Overall prestige is really high. That helps their score. Other things, their recruiting class is really high. That helps their score, and their transfer portal class is high. Also helps their score. So the system is kind of set up perfectly for Auburn and another SEC team that we'll see later on. But I think they're kind of on the easier side to rebuild just because of how prestigious their program has been. FIU is an interesting one. They score higher than a bunch of other teams because they've been so bad. They've been one of the worst teams in the country the last 4 years. Last year, they were not good. Winning percentage below 22 in the last 4 seasons. They need a lot of help. UTEP has not won a bowl game since like 1965 or 67, I think. That alone is just ridiculous. They need a bowl win. Can we get these guys a bowl win? Syracuse is another ACC team that has not been good recently. But they just got Kyle McCord from Ohio State, who, look, he might not have been the best Ohio State quarterback, but being an Ohio State quarterback and now being the Syracuse quarterback is really helping the Orange. East Carolina is a program that has been overall just pretty much average, like all these other teams that are not in the power conference. but they have been horrible as of late, which really helps their score. Or last year they were horrible. Past 4 years they've been below 500 too. Kent State was one of the worst teams in the country last season. I think they won 1 or 2 games last year. That alone is going to rank them really high, coming in at number 14. But overall, they've just been not a good program, and they need help. When I was talking about Auburn, this was the other SEC school. I was talking about the Florida Gators. My opinion is exactly the same. I don't think that they're really the 13th best team to rebuild, but just based off the formula, they score really high. The worst team in the country in the last 4 seasons, winning percentage-wise, is the UMass Minutemen. They're going to come in at number 12. They're an independent. They're moving to the MAC next season. This team has just been so bad, and that alone gives them a ton of points, coming in at number 12. South Florida also has been really bad in the past 4 years. They have a winning percentage of 17.8 since 2020. They've been really bad. They need a lot of help. Starting the top 10, we have Colorado. Now, look, I know that they get a lot of hate, and they kind of should, because, ESPN glazes them, but we can't sit here and deny the fact that they've been one of the worst power conference programs in the past 4 years, which helps their score a lot. And we also can't sit here and not talk about how Dion has one of the best transfer portal classes in the country for this team, which gives them a high score. Coming in at number 9, we have the UConn Huskies. The back-to-back defending champs in basketball has been one of the worst programs in college football. They had 1 year where they made the bowl, but they lost. Outside of that, they've just been terrible. They did not have a good year last year coming off of that bowl loss. Winning percentage of 27 in the last 4 years. This is another independent that you could maybe move to another conference and really build up as a football school. Now look, the U, Miami. This is really similar to Florida and Auburn, where they're not the 8th best team to rebuild, but I'm not going to rig the system. Looking at their score, they've been decently successful the past couple years. The prestige is really high, which helps them a lot. Their recruiting class is one of the best, which helps them a lot. And same with their transfer class. So just based off of the score, it gets them really high. I wouldn't really rebuild this team, though. Vanderbilt is a great school to rebuild. There are a couple schools that if I could rig it, I would move down, like Miami, Florida, Auburn. Vanderbilt is not one of them. They're one of the best schools to rebuild, coming in at number 7. They've been the laughing stock of the Power 4. Yes, they're already in the SEC, but they have so much work to do. They have a winning percentage of 20 over the last 4 years. Terrible year last year. They're at the bottom of the barrel of the best conference. Number 6 is Arizona State. This is another team that I have a ton of interest in rebuilding. They're in the Big 12, so they're already in a power conference, which kind of hurts their score. But they have had terrible years recently. They have a winning percentage of 39 in the last 4 seasons. All time, their prestige is pretty high, being at 60%, and their recruiting and transfer portal classes are pretty good. Starting the top 5, we have the Stanford Cardinal. Now, let me tell you guys why Stanford is in the top 5. Overall, prestige-wise, they have been a great program. Not amazing, overall 55%, but, when they had guys like Christian McCaffrey, Hogan, I can't remember his first name, the quarterback. They had another guy who I can't remember. What's his name? The quarterback who was on Houston with the long neck, Davis Mills. They were a powerhouse in the Pac-12 in the early 2010s, and they have fallen off a cliff as of late. They need to get back to that era of being a dominant team, and they're recently joined the ACC, so they're in a new conference. This is a great team to rebuild. Coming in at number 4, we have Louisiana Tech. Louisiana Tech is in the top 4 because they had a terrible year last year. They've been terrible the last 4 years with a winning percentage of 30. Their prestige is a little above 50, so they've had a decent history. This is one of the best teams to rebuild because they're in a great recruiting state in Louisiana, and they've had no success lately. Coming in at number 3, we have Southern Miss. Southern Miss is pretty much the exact same situation as Louisiana Tech. They've been pretty bad the past 4 years with a winning percentage of 34. Prestige is better than other schools in the Sun Belt, CUSA, MAC at 54%. And the recruiting class and transfer portal classes are pretty good for their conference. So there's a lot to work with this school. This is a great school to rebuild. Coming in at number 2, we have the Akron Zips. And oh my goodness, Akron has been terrible. The last 4 seasons, they have a winning percentage of 16.67. That means they win 1 of every 6 games in the last 4 years. That's atrocious. They had a really bad year last year. This is a great team to rebuild. And last but not least, coming in at number 1, I'm not surprised that Nebraska ranks so high. Look, just based off of my system, which, I didn't just put a system together just to put it together. I thought about, if you want to rebuild a team in Dynasty, who do you want to do it with? You want to do a program that has been unsuccessful as of late. Nebraska, lately they have a winning percentage of 34 over the last years. You want a team that has, a rich history. Nebraska has a really rich history. Their overall winning percentage at 68. They have a good recruiting class. Their transfer portal class is okay. But overall, they rank out at the highest in my system. Nebraska is the number 1 team to rebuild in college football 20.